All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar. I'm David Morton, a Change Management Officer within the Improvement Service, hosting this webinar on behalf of the newly launched police network, which is the Improvement Service facilitated. Our speaker today will be Andy Milne, Chief Executive at SURF, Scotland's Regeneration Forum. Just quickly before I hand over to Andy, I'll just go through the housekeeping for the webinar. This is a recorded session and details of the recording and slides will be shared with all attendees following the session. There will also be, when I hand over to Andy, he'll take you through the presentation which should appear on your screen at the moment, and following that there will be time for question and answers. You should have a small grey box on your screen with a questions tab on it. If you have any questions or throughout the course of the webinar, then please type these in here and we'll read these out to Andy to answer at the end of the session. Also, if you have any issues throughout the course of the webinar, type these into the question box and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Finally, there'll be a short survey following the webinar just to quality control and ask for suggestions for how we can keep the police network going and any improvements or speakers that you might suggest for future. So I think that covers everything, so I'll hand over to Andy for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and hello everybody. As David said, I'm Andy Milne, Chief Executive at SURF, and I've been asked today, and I'm pleased today to be telling you a bit about SURF's work in relation to our Alliance for Action programme. I'm hoping this will be of interest to people who are involved in supporting community regeneration and particularly the links between local authority capacities and responsibilities and community regeneration. So I'm going to talk very generally first of all about regeneration roles, SURF roles, very briefly on that, then focus a bit on telling you about what SURF's Alliance for Action programme is, some of the things we've learned so far, some of the developments that we expect to be coming down the line very soon, and the ways in which some people, hopefully many of you listening, might be interested in benefiting and participating in some of that work. So first of all, let me just try and move this on. I've now got my slide's stuck. Are people seeing this okay?
And it's if you just try highlight, if you try clicking the slide, I think it's just it's not fully highlighted, and then it should move through now.
All right, thank you very much for that intervention, David.
No problem.
Techniques were never my strongest role. Okay, regeneration roles. So broadly, the Scottish Government has a central leadership, resources and legislation role, as we would all understand. And very generally, local authorities have a key democratic planning and service delivery role. More and more, I think we're beginning to appreciate the knowledge, assets and initiatives held within the third sector and within residential communities themselves, and perhaps sometimes underestimated in the broader regeneration picture is the role of the private sector. That in itself is a very broad term covering some very large enterprises right through to very small local enterprises and indeed increasingly social enterprise activity, a whole variety of varied commercial activity which have a significant impact on not just regeneration, but also, in some cases, degeneration, as I'll touch on later on. So SURF's role is really about making the connections between all of those different capacities and responsibilities. Excuse me. So just to be clear, SURF is an independent organisation where we work closely with the government and with local authorities, but most importantly on a cross-sectoral basis with a focus on communities. We try to bring all of those players together, and from the learning of the experience and knowledge and expertise and examples of all of those different participants, and particularly the way in which they interact, we are able to highlight good practice and thereby inform and influence policy and practice, particularly through the Scottish Government, but also with local authority partners. We've got about 250 member organisations and just over 3,000 individual contacts across the whole country. So in terms of general context on policy, since the 2008 crash, the Scottish Government has shifted, particularly in its 2011 regeneration statement, much more towards a community-led focus in regeneration. And in support of that, I think almost everybody listening will understand that most recently there's been a Community Empowerment Act that's eventually gone through. Connected to that, some asset transfer legislation in favour of making it easier for communities to access derelict or underused assets in their communities. We learn also that there's now what was originally to be called a decentralisation bill, now to be called a local democracy bill, to be brought through probably next year. Alistair McKinlay being the Scottish Government civil servant who is piloting that. It was Alistair who piloted through the Community Empowerment legislation in 2016. So within all of that, the relationship between local authorities and individual communities in those areas is a key to successful regeneration. SURF would certainly take the view, based on our learning and experience, however, that the biggest factors affecting local regeneration stem from economic policy decisions both in the public and the private sector. So let me tell you just a little bit about SURF's Alliance for Action programme. Following that crash in 2008 and the subsequent policy shift from the Scottish Government, SURF was very much in favour of a greater focus on community-led regeneration, but had some reservations about the resourcing and capacity of that model, and particularly putting the weight of regeneration on that community-led model at a time of significant austerity and recession. So, following some work we did with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in looking at the challenges for disadvantaged communities in a context of austerity, we developed a practical Alliance for Action programme in response to what we'd learned in that work with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. We did that work focusing primarily on the comparable but very different communities of Govan in Glasgow and a place called Galton, a small community on the east side of Kirkcaldy. The twin aims then of SURF's Alliance for Action programme is to, through our intervention and collaboration by linking national and local factors, to enhance the cooperation and investment and capacity and practical outcomes at local level. So we're actually trying to deliver increased regeneration outcomes in our places of focus, but then to draw out of those places of focus learning which we can use to promote constructive debate on the wider policy and resource considerations, particularly the allocation of resources and key decisions that I referred to earlier on at the economic level. So in terms of actual sites, this map here shows 6 sites, 3 of which are in play and mature already. Those are Govan, East Kirkcaldy and Rothesay. The 3 intended sites, Dunoon is already in action in a feasibility stage, and we are in active discussion with colleagues in respective local authorities of Dumfries and Galloway and the Dundee City Council on doing new sites in Langham and in Dundee. We've selected these sites with the intention of having a robust and adequately variable set of examples in terms of scale, context and setting. I'll say more about that later on. However, in all of these works, the key link, as I've said before, is with local authorities and local community assets. So forgive me for this diagram, but I'm going to try and talk you through it. I think it's still useful for me. At the centre there, you will see 3 local authority areas in the mature sites I've referred to. Govan with Glasgow City Council, East Kirkcaldy with Fife Council and Rothesay in the case of Argyll and Bute. So at the centre then, what we're trying to do there is make closer links between all of the partners and assets in those particular areas with the respective local authorities. Round the edges of that, we are drawing in the expertise and resources and policies of larger national organisations such as the Big Lottery, Children's Scotland, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Resilient Scotland, Heritage Lottery Fund. Not all of them listed there in the diagram, but you get the idea of trying to then SURF taking its role in linking local interactions to national policy and resources and drawing the learning out for the benefit of those local authorities and for national government policy. So, taking a closer look at Govan, first of all. Here's an old map some of you may have seen before of ancient Govan, and we are coming from the west, overlooking Govan and over to Glasgow at the junction of the Kelvin. There's a very ancient map because Govan, as many of you know, is a very ancient place. On the left-hand side there, Old Govan Church, which has the Govan stones, but dating back to the 8th century. And on the right, actually, Doomster Hill, which was the first parliament of the ancient kingdom of Strathclyde. Now I mention that because these kind of roots of heritage and identity remain important. It was out of the boat building skills brought by Vikings and down the Western Isles and into Govan, landing in Govan. Out of that developed the boat building skills which brought us the world-class shipbuilding, which made massive generation of Govan as a place of industry, activity, culture and learning, particularly the boat building on an industrial scale, which everybody is familiar with in the 20th century. With those skills and resources and influx of investment, there was a substantial period which Govan grew enormously and thrived. Some of these slightly nostalgic pictures reflect that here. However, again, almost all of our listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with the industrial decline that hit the shipbuilding industry generally and certainly hit Govan very hard, so that by the 1970s, 1980s, we began to see the kind of really rapid degeneration of Govan, its disconnection from the rest of Glasgow and indeed the rest of Scotland economically and culturally, and its loss of capacity and its loss of sense of role. You may see at the bottom of this slide that these slides I've lifted from colleagues in Govan under the Central Govan Action Plan Steering Group, which is focused on the physical regeneration of Govan. I'll come back to that in the next slide. So in our Alliance for Action focus on Govan, you'll see towards the top of this interesting diagram, I hope it's interesting, in pink there the reference to Central Govan Action Plan. The consultation and feasibility work that we did, consulting with all local and relevant national partners in Govan and who have an interest in Govan, brought us to 3 overlapping priority areas: physical infrastructure, creative community participation, assets and heritage. So while the pink coloured Central Govan Action Plan at the top focuses on physical infrastructure, the links between, for instance, the BBC, the Science Centre, the Fast Link bus service, the new hospital, Govan waterfront. The physicality of that, our job is to link those physical investments as closely as possible with creative community participation, many organisations involved in that in Govan, and historical assets and current heritage from those assets still existing within Govan. In the centre there, we have a series of local projects which we think are key players at the local level in sustaining the future community participation in the community-led regeneration of Govan. And round the edges, we have the larger partners who are making investments or have responsibilities for the well-being of Govan going forward. Our job then, again, is to encourage greater investment, but perhaps as, if not more importantly, to help coordinate investments so that physical investments, physical infrastructure investments, relate to, complement and support community creative activity and build on the assets and heritage and aspirations. That's the general SURF Alliance for Action model. Our role is one of facilitating higher levels of collaboration and cooperation at the local level and drawing in a properly coordinated, intelligent way, the resources, interests and investments of larger partners. What we're essentially doing is we are testing out the viability of community-led regeneration by trying to facilitate that process in good faith and then stand back a bit and learn what can be achieved from that process and what are the limitations of what can be achieved from that process. I hope that's clear enough to now. This won't be clear enough to now, but this is simply to indicate that in this process, down the left-hand side there, we list and record and note the capacities and roles of all of the organisations involved in our Alliance for Action sites, whether they're public sector organisations, private sector organisations, community and voluntary organisations, map their links, their investments and their connections and draw learning out of that process. So, moving to learning then, I'm now going to run just through 4 or 5 slides on some of the learning that we've drawn out of this process so far. First of all, having drawn various baselines of activity, which I'll come back to later on, we developed a series of shared learning events because we found that across all of the sites we're dealing with, the creative participation, drawing in a larger number of people, greater knowledge, greater expertise, higher levels of participation through creative activities was a particularly beneficial way to go. A kind of connection to that, it became evident that food within communities and the way in which food is a medium for exchange, introduction, collaboration and cohesion was an important and useful model or medium for driving community participation and broadening community participation. We also found that people are very responsive to considerations around heritage and assets in heritage as a basis for greater community engagement. We will be doing further work based on messages coming out of the areas on the connections, particularly between health and regeneration, and I could say more about that in later discussion. Moving on to specific learning points, it's certainly clear from the work that we've done that there's a very broad appreciation of the benefits of active partnership and collaboration. It's almost a default position now in terms of support, mutual support and regeneration. And as I've said already, the benefits of more creative approaches. I don't mean just artistic-based creative approaches, but more imaginative approaches to collaboration and regeneration. This may sound like a point of self-interest, but we think there's particular added value to have by introducing a kind, not SURF, we don't seek to do this across the whole of Scotland, we're just trying to draw some learning out here, but a kind of organisation like SURF that has a no axe to grind, informed and connected but objective role to play in linking up local players and national players. In terms of practical lessons, it seems to us that policymakers through the process that we're involved in get a broader understanding of the local dynamics that affect the viability of their approach. So sometimes people are making investments or undertaking approaches and they can't quite understand why it's not getting the traction it should, they can't quite understand where the blocks are, they can't quite understand why greater benefits are not being accrued. So policymakers from our process get a better understanding of the various dynamics affecting their approach and those which can better inform their approach. Local players are encouraged and informed by the senior level and broad spectrum of interest. So local players get not just information from the input of national players like the Heritage Lottery Fund or Big Lottery or NHS Scotland, but that's an encouraging process that these bodies are interested in what's happening in the local area. And local residents get opportunities for an enhanced level of engagement and influence and indeed practical outcomes, practical benefits for their involvement, as I've referred to earlier. There are some cautionary lessons out of this, and SURF's view certainly that we can learn as much from what doesn't quite work or doesn't quite appear to connect as well as it should as from those things that do go well. So there's been a lot of talk in recent years about the importance of preventative investment, But we find that even the most respected local organisations, even those that seem very key to the success of community-led regeneration in particular areas in the current environment, are still struggling to survive, and a lot of capacity is being lost in that diversionary struggle rather than the delivery. Related to that is a view, certainly from those community organisations, and for which many people have heard before, is that present funding processes, both at a local and indeed a national level and national agency level, are competitive funding mechanisms which tend to increase local tensions, tend to make people hide their homework from each other, tend to reduce levels of collaboration that everybody says is what we're trying to achieve. Connected to that to some degree, we've seen some examples of professional status anxiety, I've called it here, where we have expected involvement from partners in a more collaborative enterprise, but have found some, what can I say, some reluctance from some partners to allow some of their decision-making processes to be significantly influenced by other partners, and particularly by community organisations. However, we have found that in those kind of situations, effective leadership is a really important ingredient, and there have been plenty of cases we've seen where good leaders have been able to come in and resolve some of those tensions, anxieties and difficulties. The question for us is how to encourage more of that kind of deviance in leadership, if you like, that more creative approach to solving problems. In terms of communities, I'll be very open to discussion on this, but SURF's view at the moment is that there's a slight danger of the community model being overloaded with a level of responsibility, sometimes from people, with all respect, who have not got an awful lot of hands-on experience of working with communities. So cautionary notes would include that the present capacity and volatility of community organisations, it tends to be overestimated in terms of capacity and underestimated in terms of the natural change that takes place within community groups. And connected to that, our view is that the underlying inequalities in society generally remain unaddressed, and that exacerbates the difficulty in building capacity in the most disadvantaged communities. Another interesting learning point for us was the importance and the difficulty and challenge, I readily acknowledge, of addressing the political realities in particular places and occasional examples of tribalism. We expect community organisations to lead on regeneration where they can, to support them in that, get them to jump through all sorts of hoops, but we don't always sufficiently honestly explain to them what the political context is, where some perhaps councillor or MP is secretly saying on a golf course in a pub somewhere, "over my dead body," while everybody else is working through the formal processes. There has to be some way of bringing a more honest discussion on what is practical, what is politically practical, and what is not, to community organisations who are already heavily burdened with responsibilities at the local level and in partnership. And connected to that again, we tend to find that all parties tend to conspire to slightly oversell isolated examples of excellence and their capacity for substantial change. That's connected back to my earlier point about some key community organisations remaining vulnerable while still being presented as leading examples of community-led regeneration. Nearing the end of this presentation now, in terms of learning outputs, we find that there's a decent argument that says even the biggest local investments are easily swamped by national policy factors. We think of the resources being lost through DWP reform as compared to relatively modest investments in place-based regeneration. A reference back to my earlier reference to private sector is that high-level political decisions and private sector investment decisions are harder to reach than local communities and individuals within communities who that term normally applies to. There's the danger of the emergence of a false narrative around regeneration and degeneration because too many small initiatives are being burdened with undeliverable challenges, the result of which is there tends to be a story comes out, oh, regeneration didn't work. And in fact, that will be the subject of SURF's annual conference later this year. What did regeneration ever do for us? Lastly, in this slide, despite all of our investments and efforts, there's still a surprising lack of focus on adequate measurement of actual outcomes from regeneration investments. So, in summary, returning to an earlier slide, this is how SURF is going to be moving forward with its Alliance for Action work, focusing on particular communities, but strengthening our relationship with the local authorities involved in those areas. The Scottish Government has recently indicated that they want to expand, in cooperation with SURF there, SURF's involvement to those 6 sites I referred to earlier, but with greater engagement with local authorities as the key leaders and deliverers of local regeneration in their respective areas. I apologise for this handwritten diagram. This is an important new development as part of that new piece of work that we're going to be expanding on with the Scottish Government. We're going to be providing a people and sector connector service where not all local authorities can be directly involved in our locally based Alliance for Action sites, of course, but what we will do is we're going to develop a cohort of between 80 and 100 members who are interested elsewhere in the country, and instead of just connecting them to individual bits of information, bits of advice, bits of signposting, there will be the opportunity to help them engage more directly with the interactive processes in particular sites and the dynamics at local level. So if somebody's particularly interested, for instance, in the relationship between housing and transport in one of these sites, if we are doing particular work on that, then they'll be able to see how that works, not just in relation to housing and transport, but how that's affected by other investments and processes in that geographical area. So, lastly, another initiative that we're coming out of this is that through our community engagement in those areas, when the SIMD statistics were launched towards the end of last year, we were contacted by a number of community organisations who said that they appreciated the SIMD statistics were valuable, but they were getting increasingly frustrated with the very negative media coverage and labelling of their communities at disadvantage, and what they want to do is to promote a Scottish index of multiple assets and aspirations. So SURF has taken on that challenge, and we are putting together a process by drawing on the learning and contacts in our Alliance for Action areas, a constructive community-led counterbalance to that negative impact of SIMD media coverage. We'll use our networks and knowledge from the Alliance for Action areas, and in cooperation with those communities project a more informed and balanced use internally and externally. And I'm pleased to say we're doing that in active collaboration with Alistair McAlpine and his colleagues who actually put together the SIMD statistics at a national level. This is a complementary activity that they are welcoming to balance their external observation of SIMD statistics. So, lastly, just to reiterate, the purpose of our Alliance for Action work is to enhance cooperation, investment capacity and practical outcomes at the local level, and to draw out learning and promote constructive debate to improve wider policy, resource and investment considerations. There's lots more on this, and we've got films, reports, diagrams, and opportunities for involvement, and you can find them easily at the SURF website. That's the end of my formal input here, but I'll really welcome the opportunity to pick up any particular points of interest that people might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Just in case anybody that's joined the webinar missed it at the start, just on how to ask questions or pick up or any comments that you might have, you should have a small grey box on your screen with a questions tab. If you just if you just type your questions in there, and then I'll read them out directly to Andy. We've got a couple of questions in already, Andy. So first one's from my colleague Irene Beautyman. An initial question. What can planning authorities do to enable the collaborative working that is happening within the Alliance for Action?
What can planning authorities? Well, that's a really good point from Irene, because one of the earlier factors that came out in our first consultations and feasibility studies was that local people couldn't quite understand why there was an apparent disconnection between physical planning processes, which of course is a formal process for communities to get involved in, and the community planning processes, which communities are encouraged to get involved in terms of informing and directing public services. So in the Govan situation I described there, some of the key participants in the Central Govan Action Plan are planning officials from Glasgow City Council. So through that process, there's an opportunity to directly link physical planning considerations to the wider regeneration dynamics and possibilities. And that's the lived reality, as people appreciate, of people in communities who don't see the distinction between a physical planning process and other investment processes. So active involvement from planners is a really important part of the work that we're trying to do in testing out how physical planning and broader community planning can be more successfully interlinked.
Thank you, Andy. Just another comment just in terms of how is this SURF, what kind of links have you had with community planning partnerships?
Yeah, it's in the different areas that we've gone into, and I know that our colleagues from some of those areas perhaps participating in today's discussion. I'll be honest enough to say that we took a slightly different approach in each case in order to ensure the best prospects for success in getting something off the ground. So on some occasions we came in with early direct involvement from community planning partnerships. In other cases we thought it wiser, and I think we've broadly been proved right, to engage with community aspirations and community assets in the first place and build up a bit of capacity before engaging with community planning processes. Community planning is a very substantial and broad and high level process, which I certainly welcome as a Scottish model which really doesn't exist elsewhere in the UK. But it's quite important that communities get their own chance to describe their own situation and make their own priorities, and then engage with community planning partnerships rather than community planning partnerships with all good intention bearing down on local communities with what are already determined priorities under the CPP. So it's about scale, really. It's about, I think community planning partnerships are really important, but I think what we're trying to do in this work is to bridge the gulf in scale between the considerations of a high-level local authority-wide community planning partnership process and a very local process based on local knowledge, assets and resources.
Thank you, Andy. Just a follow-up question to that from my colleague Andrew Maguire. You didn't say much about LOIPs or locality plans, which are likely to provide a key strategic focus for tackling many of the issues you talk about. Given your concerns about the capacity of community groups, how well do you see the community aspirations of the Community Empowerment Act being met?
Well, I think locality planning is a very welcome development. It's part. I mean, it's the kind of direction that SURF has lobbied for over some years in trying to draw the focus towards more disadvantaged areas and to make more proactive decisions in terms of investing and spreading investment to more disadvantaged areas. In terms of capacity at the community level, the reality is I think it remains varied. When we were involved in the consultations on what became the Community Empowerment Act, our main point of focus there was a concern that if underlying challenges of poverty and inequality were not being addressed at a national level, then the likelihood was that the most connected, the most confident, the most resourced communities would be able to take best advantage of community empowerment and community asset ownership legislation. To be frank, that remains a concern. The work that we're trying to do is to, as I've said, with good faith, to try and make the best use of all of these levers, including community empowerment legislation, but to draw out what then an accurate picture of what can be developed in some of these more disadvantaged areas on the back of that legislation, and where that falls short in meeting the aspirations for the regeneration of those areas. So I think community empowerment provides opportunities, but I think those opportunities remain more likely to be taken by communities that are less disadvantaged than the ones that we're concerned with, and we have made that position clear repeatedly to the Scottish Government.
Thanks, Andy. Next question is from Robert McGregor from Aberdeenshire Council. You make an important point about national policy change undermining local initiatives. So if the people who dispose most of their income in our town centres are having that income cut by welfare changes, should we be focusing more on increasing people's income than supporting physical and business / retail focused regeneration?
Could you just, I got most of that, could you just repeat the last bit of that, David?
Sure.
Should we be focusing on?
Should we be focusing more on increasing people's income than supporting physical and business focused regeneration?
I think any efforts to increase people's income is the key focus, isn't it? But there are limitations on our ability to do that, which is why we end up focusing on more local regeneration efforts. I do think, I mean, there are some very strong statistics in terms of the amount of money, I think £78 million in Dundee being lost directly out of the pockets of the poorest people in Dundee, and you have to then set that against the kind of investments that are being made in local regeneration. However, we are where we are, some things we can control, some things we can't. In this process, we make these points as strongly as we can, and then we try and see what can be achieved through building on the interactions, the knowledge and the assets that exist at local level. There is a danger here of swimming against a much stronger tide, but if that's the reality of what we're doing, again, we test out the practice of that reality as robustly as we can, and we produce the results from that and present the results from that. That's an important part of the Alliance for Action process, both the delivery of enhanced investment at the local level, but the honest reporting of what the limitations of a community-led model are in the context of wider economic and also demographic and technological change, to be fair.
Thank you, Andy. The next question is from Tom Houston. Is there an ideal size of community for SURF to get involved?
An ideal size, yes. What we're trying to do here is to focus on distinct communities, self-identified communities, and we are trying not to stretch beyond 15, 20,000, because I think by the time you do that, you're dealing really with a series of sub-communities who will not all have concurrent agreement on their priorities and the importance of the issues to be tackled and the assets at hand. So again, as I say, we're trying to make a bridge between smaller, genuinely coherent and authentic communities and the broader planning processes of local authorities and the focus of regional and national agencies. It is about that connective function that we're concerned with. So answer to the question would be certainly not more than 15,000, 20,000.
Thanks, Andy. The next question is from Mike McLean. Are there plans to use digital or collaborative technology to encourage off-site participation and learning?
Yes, many of the partners that we're involved with have interest and capacity in supporting greater digital participation. That's been the case in Rothesay, on Bute. Colleagues in the Scottish Towns Partnership, Architecture and Design Scotland and others have been working on more digital interaction. And in the feasibility study of the work in Rothesay in particular, we used a good deal of social media and new technology approaches to ensuring greater awareness and participation from young people, school kids, schools themselves, and older people. So it's a good point well made. It's an important function of the communication of knowledge and ideas, and a good way of people being involved without going through the usual processes of marching down the road on a wet Tuesday night to an agenda of 18 items at a local meeting.
Thanks, Andy. The next question is from Phil Prentice. Too often CPPs are ineffective.
Phil.
Too often CPPs are ineffective with councils doing all the lifting. When will we begin to genuinely get NHS, Scottish Enterprise, Visit, STS, DWP, etc. to see the regeneration agenda as their own agenda as well?
Well, thanks, Phil. I mean, that's very much the ongoing struggle in this process, and what we're reporting back to the Scottish Government on this, and indeed to Highlands and Islands Enterprise, who also invest in this process with us, is how some of these larger agencies are responding to this initiative. SURF has the benefit of having the local fabric contact and connections, but also the high-level national connections. So we are able to provide feedback to the government and to COSLA and to individual local authority partners which organisations do find themselves able to genuinely grasp the understanding, grasp the opportunity for participation here, and those which don't. I made some reference in my presentation to issues of professional status anxiety and turf and trust issues, and that has come out quite strongly. Some organisations I thought and understood from conversations I had were willing and ready to be involved, have frankly not delivered, haven't delivered in the process, and don't really deliver at that local fabric level. I think the situation around them is changing, and we want to support that change through this learning process.
Thank you, Andy. We've still got about 15 minutes left if there's other questions to come in. Just back to Irene for a couple. Firstly, we have you or would you consider using the Place Standard tool as part of your conversation with communities?
The Place Standard tool is certainly one of the very useful mechanisms that are out there. In the processes that we do in the early consultation feasibility process, if that's brought forward as a particularly useful mechanism, most suitable for the context and challenges we're dealing with, that's the one that gets used. Equally, we have been using charrette participative planning processes. There's one ongoing in Dunoon at the moment. We did one in Rothesay. We expect to do others elsewhere. So it's to use that cliche of horses for courses, it's whatever fits most adequately for the local partners involved and the challenges that they're facing. But certainly that model is a well-known and appreciated one that's available for use.
Right. And secondly, community planning will now be consulting communities directly stemming from the Community Empowerment Act. How will duplication of consultation be avoided?
Yeah, that's a real problem, isn't it? Many communities, and certainly communities in more disadvantaged areas, are exhausted with consultation and being asked what it is they need in their area, when in fact what most people actually want is just a decent job so they can look after their families and themselves without being subject to a regeneration initiative. However, given where we are, this is why in our process we have tried to make sure that we're not simply doing a consultation process, that we are in both in the feasibility and in the delivery phase actually delivering enhanced investments so that people can see that they're not just being consulted, that new investments of whatever scale are coming in so that people can see positive change happening. I think people are willing to participate, but only as long as they can see actual change taking place as they participate, rather than the jam tomorrow, you'll get the benefit in 2 years' time story, which occasionally disappoints people and tends to frustrate them. So there is, I totally accept that we've got ourselves in a position where there's been over-consultation and lack of delivery. So we need more delivery and the right level of consultation. I would suggest that broadly we know quite a lot of what the problems are, quite a lot of who the potential participants and assets are. It's about, as I say, making some progress as we develop the conversations.
Thank you, Andy. That appears to be all the questions that we have for the moment. I'll just very quickly, before we round up, I'd just quickly like to showcase the new Place Network Knowledge Hub page. Later, as I mentioned at the start of the webinar, this was a recorded session, and we will have the slides and recording available via this page either later today or tomorrow. If you are interested in accessing either of these, then please submit a membership request to the group, and one of the facilitators will get back to you on that. We'll also put out the usual circulation email to let people know when the recording and the presentation are available. I'd like to extend a massive thanks to Andy for presenting today. We've got one final question from Phil Prentice, who's wondering, will Queen of the South stay up this year?
I'm more focused on the Edinburgh Derby tonight, Phil, but thanks for your interest.
So we'll be circulating the recording and the slides following this presentation. Also, finally, we'll have a survey which will immediately follow this webinar. So if you could please fill that out and let us know how you found the experience and any ideas for improvement in the future. So once again, thanks to Andy, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.